Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. I am your host, Justin Dixon, and today we've got Jeffrey Fidelman on the podcast. He is the founder and CEO of Fidelman Co. Interesting kind of conversation because he's on the investment banking and capital raising side. So he started this business back in 2015 after graduating from Harvard, spending time as in an investment bank as well as in a family office, and really started it as a consulting business to help startup founders raise money and create their content, their pitch decks, et cetera, et cetera. And then he kind of transitioned it into an investment bank that helps these startups raise money, whether it's directly from high net worth individuals, VC firms, and even private equity groups. So we dig in really deep about the kind of psychology of founders and some things that if you are a founder listening to this, things you need to think about and questions you need to be able to answer when going into pitch to investors to raise money. So really cool episode. I think you'll get a lot out of it. So let's get Jeffrey on the pod. Interested in hearing conversations with private equity leaders, CEOs of private equity-backed companies, and startup entrepreneurs where they share their stories about their career journeys, starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, and the important role that having the right talent plays in building a successful business, then you are in the right place. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. Here's your host, Justin Dixon. All right, Jeffrey, thank you for being a guest on the pod.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Justin.
No, I'm excited to jump in. So I guess, while we get started here, give everybody a little bit of an overview of who you are, where you are, and what you're up to right now.
Sure. Jeffrey Fidelman. I'm located in Connecticut now. I'm from the Northeast originally. Graduated Harvard. I spent about half a decade in banking, the first half at Morgan Stanley and the other half at HSBC. I then went over to a family office that recruited me to help them deploy a venture capital fund. The thesis of that fund was early stage tech-enabled types of investments where we would anchor the round and then help the founders syndicate the rest of the capital. And in 2015, I had left that position and started what is now an investment bank specifically focused on early stage companies and emerging managers. And what we do today is help companies with fundraising preparation. So decks, models, valuations, capital structure design. We do all of that in-house. We have about 35 people with us, just under 40, all remote, all US and Canadian based, and also fundraising execution. And we take a unique approach there where we call it Fundraise as a service. Effectively, we have subscribed to all of the investor database platforms, the PitchBooks, Prequins, Fintrix, ZoomInfo. There's probably a few that I'm missing. Aggregated them into a single platform, a database internally, and then layer an analyst on top to do all of the outreach on our clients' behalf. So we can think about it almost as outsourced investment relations, where we'll bring the infrastructure on a month-to-month basis into our clients and do all of the outreach to investors, setting our clients up for meetings with qualified and interested investors. So that's a little bit about me, what I do, and how I do what I do.
Awesome. I guess before we jump into your business, I guess, talk a little about kind of your journey, because I like people's origin stories of how they kind of get to certain areas. Obviously, graduating Harvard, a lot of times people go into consulting or banking or startups and all of that stuff. So you went into kind of investment banking. Yes, how did your kind of career trajectory from iBanking to the family office space? Some of them are more faster paced than others from the family office perspective, but how did that kind of prepare you for kind of that deploying kind of venture funds and all that into startups?
So I think my experience in banking gave me a very unique institutional perspective. I say unique now because of everything I suppose I'd gone through since then, but it gave me really an appreciation for creating structure, for following that structure, for being able to, for better or for worse at that time, for being this machine that could actually spend time deploying something and then being able to take data off of whatever that deployment was and iterate to make it better. And as I moved from banking into venture, I recognized that structure is a lot harder to create. It needs to be created. And there are a lot of misnomers around what happens both in institutional world and then how to apply those same structures and and efficiencies to startup world, especially when I'm talking about raising capital or deploying capital into those types of companies.
Interesting. Okay.
And,
I
and
guess
what,
the other thing that I was curious about, because you've kind of been on the other side. So I have a lot of people on the podcast that are startup founders. So they've raised money or are raising money, or people on the other side of the transaction from a private equity perspective that are investing and acquiring these businesses. So when you were in the family office and deploying capital, what time frame was that?
2013, 14.
Okay.
Into
So coming out of the financial crisis of 08, 09, I don't remember how the M&A market was at that period, but maybe thinking back, like, what kind of businesses were you seeing and what kind of challenges were you seeing when you were trying to find businesses to deploy capital into?
So I think there have been a few, taking a step back and then to answer your question, I think there have been a few kind of interesting points of inflection around entrepreneurship in general and around specifically technology businesses. You had 2001's those odds where you had the internet bubble, then fast forward, you had 2008, then fast forward again, 2011, fast forward again, 2015, 16, you had kind of marketplaces and all these things start to expand. Ride sharing, similarly to those, and then again and again, and I'll kind of go into the future in a bit. But to address at that point, there's a lot of crowdfunding that was starting to come out, a lot of retail investor participation in early stage venture as well. And I think Title IV was passed at that time. Regulation A was passed around that time to allow companies to raise under those auspices. And ultimately, what happened was that a lot of companies were trying to do a lot of different things. And what I recognized worked was that in crowdfunding, and many will consider this to be true today, it's really a function of marketing. How much money, how much effort you put in, how many evangelists can you get to go out and support your business is really what the return you will get in how much money you'll raise. And I think around that time, it was also a defining moment for, I'll call it venture banking, not in the sense of what SVB did, but more in the sense of what we are doing or what other advisors and brokers in the space are doing, which is representing capital raises for earlier stage companies. And it was around that time, 2015, towards the end of 2015 is when we started this business. It was around that time that I recognized that that system is broken. It works at Morgan Stanley, it works at Goldman Sachs, Jefferies, Lazard. It works at mid-market banks as well, because you have a client who's generating revenue. You're selling that to a known network of investors that you have. And the reputational risk that you take on is really a matter of diligence. But above and beyond that, there is some sort of inherent diligence that the investor does based on growth. When you're looking at it at early stage, pre-seed, seed, even Series A, the dynamic is very different. Those are pre-revenue, just revenue, maybe some semblance of profitability or not. And statistically speaking, most of those companies will fail. So when you have an advisor enter that type of market and try to create a business around it, representing individual companies with known investors becomes very difficult. Because even if they do enough diligence on it, regardless, you're going to have a lot of those companies fail. And the relationship between the advisor and the company is reversed, where Company A goes to John Smith, the broker. He introduces them to Mary Sue, the investor. Company B comes to the broker, Mary Sue, the investor. Company C, Mary Sue, the investor. Company D, E, F, G, Mary Sue, the investor. So despite the company paying some sort of success fee or otherwise, the actual relationship between that advisor is with their group of investors. And I can get into it more later on in the conversation, but that's really why, even when we started this business back in 2015, the first 2, 3, 4 years were a consulting firm, not an investment bank, which is where we were trying to help companies put together their fundraising materials, their presentations, and their strategies on how they would ultimately execute those fundraisers.
Did you also, ultimately know that you wanted to start your own business? Because I'm always curious about like the entrepreneurial journey, because it's different working for a company than it is starting a company and then building that business. And obviously you've got over 30 people now. So like when you're thinking back to, college or even post-college, like was starting, Fidelman and Co. always kind of your North Star of like, this is what I want to do? Or at what point in that, your career did you like say like, I need to go fix this problem, help people, with their marketing and fundraising materials, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously it grew into what it is now.
I think it was a little bit of both. When you say it was at my North Star, I think I had more of a direction that I was going into. And since high school or college or over the past years, I find that I'm continuing to define and refine the directionality. But it's always been I've never had to pivot hard left or hard right. I'll put it that way. Yes, I've always wanted to start my own thing, business or practice or otherwise. I did not think that it was going to be in investment banking. I started a few businesses. Some did well, some did poorly, or not at all, rather. But I knew I wanted to work for myself. And I think the joke that kind of hits home more now than it ever has before was someone once told me that when you work for someone, you have one boss. When you work for yourself, you have 100 bosses. And I find that to be so true. I mean, even when I speak to my team, I have found myself telling them that, yes, despite you work for me, you work for the company, I am just a conduit of my clients. If we are delivering to our clients what we promise them and where we set their expectations at, then they're going to be happy and I'm going to be happy and you should be happy. If we're not delivering to them based on what we told them we were going to, then no one in that equation should or will be happy.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the, grass is greener on the other side component of it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more or different headaches that go into and different stresses that go into being an entrepreneur or business owner than it is to, be an employee, pluses and minuses and all that stuff. But let's dig into the firm a little bit more. So obviously it sounds like you started a little bit as a consulting firm, kind of helping these startups kind of with their fundraising and fundraising materials. Talk me through kind of the offering now. So like if I'm a startup and maybe I'm an AI tech company, because AI, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but and at what point do you like to be brought in? And it may be a different answer. At what point do you typically get brought in, right? So what's the ideal scenario for you to kind of get brought into a company? Then what's your typical, engagement look like?
Right. So not to answer that question with it depends, but it depends. And it really depends on usually the founder, the founding team, and the materials that they have ready already. I don't want to say worst case or best case, but let's say someone comes to us, they can come to us an idea on a napkin saying we have this business, we don't have any of the materials ready already, then we can build all of the materials out. So a deck, model, valuation, all of those bits and pieces. Our approach in how we actually take that, we take a very high touch approach with our clients. So in building out those materials, it's often myself that's going through kind of the motions and the narrative with them. There's a lot of, I don't want to say devil's advocate, but I try to tell our clients that I will try to ask them any questions that an investor will. But at the very least, they won't be caught off guard in those presentations. And I find that the more a founder is engaged in the process of creating collateral, if it's with us, if they've already created it, this is kind of a moot point.
Yeah.
If they're creating it, I don't like to just take something and come back a week or two later with a completed presentation. It's really, really important for the founder to be involved in that process so that they know why every period is on every page or graphic or sentence and how it was composed, because it's ultimately their narrative that was put into a slide deck. Same thing with the model, very high touch. Again, not to build out all the formulas, but to make sure that we are aligned on this is how I envision the business working. We've put it into model form. They confirm that, yes, this is in fact how I think about the business, and then we start to build it out. In terms of Fundraise as a service, I'm very transparent about the process. I often joke that nothing we do is necessarily proprietary. What we have, the database, the workflow, how we approach everything perhaps is, but ultimately what we end up doing is implementing best practices from a capital raise into our clients. What that means is that we have access to all the platforms, and perhaps there's economies of scale with what we do and how we pass that savings off to our clients. But it is, in fact, a very manual process. We're not sending 1,000 emails a day or 1,000 emails a week. There's about 100, 150 investors that are targeted per client that engages with us on a weekly basis. The analyst who's on that opportunity will qualify each one individually, will personalize each one individually, and then put them into essentially what looks like a marketing campaign. So outbound calls and emails over the course of, let's say, 2 weeks. We continue to be high touch with our clients, even in the fundraise process. We have weekly reports that go out to them. All the investor data that we are using for their outreach is theirs. So contact, personalization, notes, status of every investor is reported in a live sheet. And then we actually have a call with all of our clients, at least on a weekly basis as well, with myself included, where we can talk about the report and adjust strategy. So despite being kind of in this realm of advisory fundraising brokers, we really are trying to mimic what would ultimately be an investment relations department. So maybe in-source investment relations is how I would call it.
Yeah. Interesting. So if I'm a startup founder and I need to go raise, I'm just going to use round math, $1 million. And let's say I know I have this idea and maybe I raised a little bit of capital. So I have like a deck that I created myself. But now I'm I'm going out to the big boys and girls and raising money from sophisticated investors, not just my friends or family that, maybe just like, hey, we'll give Justin some money because I think he's a good dude. What are some of the things that you see consistently with founders that, to your point, you said like if they're engaged in the process, you're going to ask questions that they're going to get from institutional investors, from other really sophisticated investors. Like, what are the biggest challenges that you see on a repeated basis that, if you could kind of wave a magic wand that founders would kind of grasp when they're going into these pitches to raise money?
So I have many, so I'm jotting a few down as you're saying it. I'll start with saying modesty is a great policy, except when you're raising capital.
Okay.
So I'll put that out first. The two main points, perhaps, that I would at least begin with is both the structure of the meetings you have with an investor, as well as making sure you actually ask for money. And I'll address those backwards.
That's interesting.
So, with investors, to take a step back, the psychology or who you're reaching out to, this is not like software sales where you're trying to call someone to give them something they don't need. An investor, by definition of what they do from a role and responsibility perspective, is in order to make money, they must deploy capital. Investors don't make money by raising money and sitting on it, although maybe some do, some don't. But the 2% fee is not where anybody makes money. They make money on carry, and carry only comes if they invest money. So in your outreach to an investor, keep that in mind. You're reaching out to someone who effectively, as long as you target them correctly, want to speak with you. They want to have that conversation with you. Again, as long as you target them correctly. They want to deploy capital because that's their business of what they do. So when you do connect with them and you do have that conversation, believe it or not, oftentimes I will kind of catch some of our clients not asking for money on the calls. And it's really important to remember that however good or however bad that call went, there's a purpose to that call, and it is ultimately for that person, that investor, to give you money. So make sure that at some point in the call, usually towards the end, I'll address that in a moment, but make sure you ask for money and you leave enough time to have that conversation around, I am raising this much, like, how do you write your checks? What's your diligence process? Can we set up a next meeting? Leave time for that at the end of the call. So what does a call look like? And I'm not going to eat up the time here on the podcast, but just to run through it quickly, I usually tell people that within a dozen calls, you should be in kind of like Tetris mode, meaning you can have a call with someone, and if video is off, you can be playing Tetris on your phone and basically say the same things. 30-minute call. Back half of it, 15 minutes, will be left for Q&A. Front half of it is what really needs to be structured. If you start breaking that down further, the first 3 minutes, let's say, is building rapport. So don't talk about business. Talk about the weather. Talk about animals, pets. Talk about travel, kids, whatever the case may be. And then that'll usually kind of teeter off into, okay, let's have the business conversation.
Yep.
you always want to have the investor go first and give their introduction. Hey, so, why don't you go first? Tell me a bit about your thesis, the fund. And in 99% of the cases, they will have this Tetris-brained response where they'll give you their name, their background, fund 3, this is my thesis, this is what we're investing in, etc. And it'll allow you, to the extent needed, to tailor some keywords or buzzwords that you might be able to for that investor. After that, let's say that's another 3 minutes, you're 6 minutes into that first, call it like 15, 16 minutes. And then it's your time to speak. You really only have about 5 minutes to get your whole pitch out. And the point isn't necessarily to get everything out, but it's rather to make sure that there are enough gaps and holes and questions that you can engage in a Q&A and you make it interactive. So the last point I'll say on that is, in your presentation, I almost always recommend to people to use an anecdote. So don't try to go through like problem, market, solution necessarily in such a structured way. Investors can read, there's a deck you'll send after the call, but go through an anecdote, like make it real for them. So it's tangible that either they have experienced this situation before, or at the very least, they know someone who has experienced this situation before and they've been third party to it. So I'll kind of leave it at those 2 points.
No, I think, and that kind of dovetails into what I was going to ask next, is like, what are some of the big questions? So if a founder's listening to this call and they're like, oh man, I'm going to start raising money and I've never done it before, like, what are some of the kind of table stakes questions that, because you raise money, you've been in, you've deployed capital, and obviously you've helped, a lot of people through this process. Like, what are some of the main questions that founders need to know that maybe they don't know enough of, or they should be, it should be like robotic? Because I do some angel investing and I've sit in a lot of pitches, and sometimes they don't know their numbers, they don't know their financials as well as I think that they should, or their customer acquisition costs or whatever. Like, what are some of the things, as you see it a lot more than I do, that if you're a founder, like, you need to have this information known cold, kind of in your Tetris mode, like, I just know what it is off the top of my head?
So again, I mean, it depends on the stage and what you're raising for and what your company or product is. I would say, to start very high level, use of funds, how that capital is going to be deployed, what are the levers that are most important that are essentially controlling your business. All of that being said, even higher level, the whole point of that initial conversation and even sharing the deck is to make sure from a binary perspective that the investor is walking away thinking or knowing how they're going to make money with you. At the end of the day, I mean, altruism aside, this is a business. They're in a fund. They have to carry to make and everything else, and investors to represent, even if it's themselves that they're representing their interests. Make sure they understand walking away from your meeting, not only how, but the fact that they will, or they believe that they will make money with you. And if you start breaking that kind of like high level, this is my goal down, then it goes into, okay, origination, sales process, post-sales process, like that whole womb to tomb, so to speak, operations. So you want to be able to address, here's our go-to-market, here's our origination strategy, here's our distribution strategy. This is either proven demand or how we are going to go to market and approach that. Sales, numbers, business model, again, keeping it high level. This is how we're thinking about our economics, how we're charging, maybe what our margins are or COGS are, or something along those lines. Again, high level, especially for the first presentation or the first answer to kind of an initial question. And then post-sale, right? Like, is this a recurring revenue? Is there a way to make it recurring? How do we continue to engage the people that we've sold to if it isn't necessarily a recurring revenue type of business? So making sure that you touch on those points, or at least know those points from a qualitative perspective, is incredibly important to walk somebody through that narrative. And honestly, a lot of clients, a lot of people I've seen personally will have like Post-it notes on their laptop or on like one of their screens during an investor call. Sometimes literally Post-it notes, sometimes like a Google Doc with like ROAS or CAC or what is their cost per click and how that's involved. I mean, those are, you should know them, or at the very least know how to get them really, really easily.
Yeah. I've got to ask this. A lot of the pitches that I see when they look at their future projections, it's always a hockey stick up and to the right. Is that something that they are coached to do? Is that something that investment or private equity groups or investors need to see? Because if you show a slide that has kind of almost more steady, gradual growth, that may be actually realistic, as opposed to this, like, we're going to go from $1 million to 100 million in 18 months, and we don't really have a clear path to do it. Like, why do they all have that?
It's a question I've asked myself for quite some time as well, including valuations, and now you see a lot of these valuations not only having down rounds, but even the whole talk about multiple articles I think today came out around IPOs being back on the market now that these super overvalued companies want to return liquidity to their investors. It's something in between. You want to be realistic. For example, and I'll come back to revenue, but on expenses and like how much you should raise, I'll always say that there's two steps to that, and you almost have to meet in the middle, right? On one hand, you build a model. Imagine you have a blank check, unlimited funds. How would you spend it? And then on the other hand, let's bring reality into the case and say, well, you're not going to be able to hire 100 engineers in 6 months or in 3 months. I mean, maybe it's possible theoretically speaking, but practically speaking, it's not probable. So you have to kind of come to the middle with how much money you're looking to raise and the use of funds, and not have these crazy high fly dreams of whether or not it's actually possible to deploy that much capital that quickly.
Yeah.
And that, now to answer your question around revenue, you have to look at it the same way. And I'm not sure, maybe investors have, maybe they haven't been, maybe it's a game of like just chasing valuation. But if you have that hockey stick, it's really important for you to be able to substantiate that, because ultimately what you're doing is you are bringing on a partner to your business. You are setting their expectations at X, and maybe even the valuation that you're raising at based on X. And now you're going to be under the gun, essentially trying to get to that number, right? Like VCs are investing for a 40x return because so many of their companies early on will fail or break even. So
they need that one that's going to outperform to make the fund make sense. Yeah.
Right. And that's the, unfortunate part, that I would rather be conservative and then outperform, but that mentality may not necessarily raise you the capital that you want or you need.
So you need to have that hockey stick because the VC needs a 40x return versus somebody else that may want a 10x return. So you could almost be a little more realistic. Is it a little bit of knowing your audience, and do you adjust it depending on if you're like talking to maybe a family office that their horizon is a little bit different than, Silicon Valley VC that needs that 40x return in, 12 to 18, 30, 2 to 3 years kind of thing.
So on one hand, I don't think you need it. I think you should be realistic with your numbers. And I think in some cases, in some businesses, with enough adoption, with the right investors strategically, and sharing amongst portfolio companies and adding additional lines of distribution, it's not only possible, but we're seeing it, I don't want to say daily, but we see it often happen through almost every economic environment and cycle. On the other side of what you mentioned, also, I would say no, I don't think that you should change anything based on your investor audience. Okay. Take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but especially financials or anything around those lines. And I know some people will disagree with me. I think perhaps from a positioning perspective, in terms of like the maybe pain points that are going to resonate a bit more, but fundamentally, both as a product and business, and also a business model, I would never suggest that our clients, or really anyone listening to this, change your business model based on your audience to that extent, because it's a small world. Yeah. And although it may not happen, it can happen that things are shared between one another, and then your round is blown up because you just shared, one deck with one investor, another deck with another, and they happen to go to the same country club and talk about it.
Got it. I've got a couple more questions, but I wanted to ask this because I saw something the other day, or talked to somebody about it, and I guess is there a thing that you can raise too much money? So if a founder has this business and they're like, it's really attractive, right? And so they just get kind of drunk on their own supply, and so they raise a ton of money, and then I guess, is there something that happens where if you raise too much money, you spend it maybe with parties and, bonuses and all this stuff versus raising enough money to execute your plan efficiently with some buffer in there, as far as that goes?
That's an interesting. I hadn't even thought about that piece until you said the partying. Yes is the short answer. Initially, my thought is that if you raise too much money, it also is coming in at a certain valuation. Either that valuation is too high, again, going off of the too much money comment, or it's not too high and you've given up too much equity. And that's ultimately what money is buying you, or money is buying the investor. So raising too much money is often hand in hand with perhaps giving up too much equity. If you didn't need to raise that much, and again, whatever too much is, let's say too much is more than what you need, then you're giving up more than what you need, quite frankly. So too much money raised is too much equity given away, I guess. And I think that, to your other point in terms of spending and how you think about spending, there's probably a certain line. And there's probably two sides of the same coin that I can talk about. On one hand, whether it was a venture investor or maybe even in school, we were talking about like entrepreneurship, where Series A-ish, once you have a defined customer, product market fit, you have a return on ad spend or ROI on investment in however you're generating clients, at that point, you've built a fire. Now, like, pour as much gasoline on the fire as possible. Yes, there's a bell curve at a certain point, but like, you'll figure it out as you spend money down. And on the other hand, yes, if you raise too much and you have too much at your disposal, then and this is maybe more psychological, so it depends on the individual, but I can absolutely see the proclivity of not spending as wisely as you would if you raised half as much or not enough money or just enough money.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. For whatever reason, the whole WeWork, documentary thing was popping in my brain about all the parties and all that stuff. But yeah, so that's why.
But even behind that, like, I don't render judgment or opinion. I mean, obviously smart guy, regardless of how anyone thinks about it or looks at it. And, he built evangelism through those events. I mean, could he have done 25% less and had the same result? Maybe. I don't know. But there was definitely purpose behind it. I don't want to discredit him entirely for doing those things.
Oh yeah, I don't know enough about it to pass judgment. That was just the thing that popped in my brain when I was asking that question. I guess I'm curious a little bit about the types of investors. So I think you mentioned like you kind of reach out to a kind of almost a curated list. And I think, a lot of the caveat here is that a lot of it depends on the client that you're working with or the business that you're trying to raise money for. But I would say broad strokes is your database of people that are engaged with your company that want to see deal flow from you. Are they individuals, just high net worth people that want to deploy capital? Are they venture funds? Are they family offices that have a fund? Are they private equity groups? It probably is all of the above, but like, I'm just kind of curious of the dynamic. So, if you get a company that says, hey, I need to raise money and I've struggled, and then, you obviously can help them because you have these other or multiple different avenues to go down.
Sure. So before answering that, keep in mind the way that we do reach out to investors is because we have data and we've spoken to them, most likely through other client interactions. So when one of our analysts reaches out, they're reaching out from ABC company, calling from ABC, or this is Alex at abc.com, and they're not necessarily reaching out from Fidelman Company.
Oh, and so they act as if they are part of the company that you're raising money for.
Exactly. So that's one of the biggest, I guess, differences between what we do versus what a lot of others do, which is I'm not selling my phone book of 32 contacts, and we approach it from a different perspective. We, on the other hand, have been reaching out to many investors and have investors in our network where we know their criteria, and instead of targeting any of them on an individual basis, just so we can maintain our client relationships really being focused on client, we do share a deal book with them. It was on a quarterly basis. Now that the business has grown a bit more, it will start being on a monthly basis where they'll see all the new deals that essentially we have. I don't call it on platform, but in our ecosystem that we're helping raise capital for. So we are getting clients in front of investors both because of Fundraise as a service and what they engage us for, but also us as Fidelman and Company building those relationships with investors on an individual basis and putting our clients in front of them.
And I guess to answer it again, or ask it a little bit of different, is it kind of all of the above? So like if I'm an accredited investor, could I be somebody that you engage with, or
Yes.
Or if I work at ABC Private Equity Group, but we have a venture arm, maybe you guys, they want to see deals that are kind of seed to Series A, and so do you have kind of this Rolodex or this outreach, I guess, that you build that's custom that includes individuals, private equity, venture capital, family office, et cetera?
So yes, we do.
Okay.
Because of all the platforms we subscribe to, we are ultimately able to target people whom we have an understanding that have some sort of understanding of their investment philosophy or thesis or their prior investment history through one of those platforms, if not through kind of a coordination between all of those platforms. And then we've been doing this for a while. So we have a pretty robust database where we can categorize investors based on vertical preference, stage preference, geographic preference, however they want to go about it. So we're able to target both family offices, venture, private equity, high net worth individuals, angel investors. Angel groups typically have their own kind of submission process, but we can do that as well. Because it's really more about the workflow that we implement and the access to data that we have, as opposed to relationships.
Yeah.
And I'll kind of quickly I know we're almost at time, but I'll quickly tell this anecdote that one of the first interactions I had at Morgan Stanley, we were in an onboarding class. This was up in somewhere in Purchase, New York. And Jim Gorman, I think, was the CEO at the time. He must have been. He walked in the room to kind of like give an impromptu speech. And the quick speech he gave was basically like, everyone take out your phone. If I asked you to call everyone in your phone book and have a 10-minute conversation with them, how long would it take you? How many days? 2 weeks, 3, let's say people are sick, vacation, 4 weeks, right? If after 4 weeks, they're not calling you back, they don't deserve to be in your phone book. And that's really the extent of your network. Even if someone makes an introduction, that's another 2-3 weeks, like you're done after 6 to 8 weeks. That's it. Your network is exhausted and spent. Now what do you do? And that stuck with me, going back to one of your earlier questions, that kind of really stuck with me throughout my entire career, which was, yes, of course it's important to build a network, but it's not something that you should always only rely on. And you need to be able to figure out a way to expand beyond that. And our solution was Fundraise as a service.
Well, speaking of fundraising, that's obviously been a big topic here. We're in a very interesting geopolitical, macroeconomic environment. We're recording this in kind of early June 2025. Again, I do a lot of work with private equity and startups and stuff. And so, what is your take on the fundraising M&A environment? Just because you're on the front end of it and trying to raise money, like, I'm guessing it's more challenging than it was in 2021 when everybody was crazy valuations and throwing money at anything. So maybe just talk a little bit about the kind of macro capital raising environment.
So I'll give you macro and then maybe even a bit of micro. From a macro perspective, even taking a step above and beyond that, we're in a really interesting time where I almost see like a reverse bubble of capital that's waiting to be deployed. And even if you look at the past 2019, the past 6 years, it's been a cycle in and of itself because you had so much money go into both companies and funds in the early piece of that, 19, 20, 21, and then very little capital that is either returned or that has been deployed. And you've created a situation where I believe the last stat I read was something like $1.7 trillion is locked up in pre-IPO private equity, including venture funds that are just in cash, essentially, cash or cash equivalents. And when you think about that, a lot of these funds have certain deployment windows and certain lifespans. And that window is 5 years, let's say plus or minus a few extensions. And we're really now at the tail end of that. So from just a statistical perspective, there is a ton of capital that needs to get deployed. And what I've seen over the past, let's say 6 months, or on more of a micro level, is that Q4 of 24, we actually saw a lot of transactions start to happen again. Investments were being made. companies were not only raising capital, but they were having more investor conversations, even into the end of the year, holiday time. And Q1, tariffs, geopolitical environment, a few other kind of bits and pieces going on around the world, just was absolutely very quiet, both from companies wanting to raise capital. I think they sensed what was going on in the market, as well as investors that were willing to deploy capital. And what I would say is, it's interesting. I almost feel like I have a leading indicator, because in the past 3 weeks, in the past 4 weeks, we've seen an incredible spike in both investor conversations with existing clients. We've seen some capital already being invested and deployed in the past couple of weeks, being raised by our clients. And also similarly, clients looking to go out and start raising capital as well. And
that's good to know.
And even today, June 4th, on the 2025, even today or yesterday, I was reading articles around how a lot of late stage venture companies are now reconsidering IPOs and not staying private and not doing secondaries and not deploying additional capital. Because it's kind of to that point in time where there is so much liquidity that is kind of trapped in some of these private transactions that it's preventing more investment from being done and more innovation from being done.
Yeah.
But I think we're kind of, that's why I say we're in a reverse bubble, so to speak. I don't know how else to call it, where I do think that there's a lot of capital to be deployed into the market.
Yeah. And I guess this is not a real quick answer or question, but like, how do you see AI being instrumental, or how do you see it being deployed from a capital raising standpoint? So not necessarily, an AI company, but more of like, how are you using AI to help automate some of these, fundraising processes? Are you hearing from other iBanks or private equity groups that are utilizing AI to, streamline or do research or any of the above? Like, how are you seeing AI from a fundraising standpoint, not necessarily a fundraising company standpoint?
So it's interesting. We actually built an AI at the end of I believe it was 23 going into 24. And we built an AI to essentially automate a lot of the personalization, qualification, a lot of the sourcing. So instead of having 100 leads a week, we can go through 300, 400, 500 leads a week. We had an auto dialer, which was able to call 5 people at the same time. Whoever picked up first would be connected to the analyst, and they were supposed to do what they do: set up meetings, pitch the opportunity, set up a meeting, or present the opportunity rather. And what we saw in doing that was an incredible drop of efficiency. I mean, like off a cliff entirely. And the reason for that was, although AI was able to pour through so much information and assist on that side, the analyst trying to increase volume to that extent all of a sudden was connected to someone with no conviction, never having seen that name before, never having personalized it themselves. And ultimately, we went back to full manual, where an analyst spends 3 minutes on every lead, let's say, who they will look at the website, they will look at the LinkedIn if available, they will look at the information and build a conviction, even if it's a 60-second conviction, of why this is a good investor to reach out to. And now when they call or when they email, there is that conviction that comes through, because it's not the first time they're seeing his or her name or his or her fund of the investor that they're speaking to. They've seen it before, and there's a reason there. I know the reason I'm calling you, and it's not because AI qualified and personalized you.
So essentially, you're saying that AI was almost too efficient. So your people were seeing a name pop up on their screen because that person answered the phone, and then they've got to quickly kind of identify, okay, this is why I'm calling this specific fund. Even if you're doing a campaign for the same company, you still need to know who's on the other end of the phone. To the point that you're not selling software, right? You're not selling, hey, this is why I'm calling, and you need cybersecurity software. It's like, no, this is like, because you need to know the persona and all that. That's actually fascinating. I didn't.
Right. So the manual piece works, and I believe that AI is great at augmenting. I mean, we use it for some items internally, for sure, whether it's content ideation, whether it's on the design or copyright side for decks, research, even research on investors. But we have a very manual process internally on the analyst side. And we're building something now that will be a little bit more client facing and easier to use in terms of like be your own banker, so to speak,
Yeah.
with our database and our workflow. But even on that, my consideration on AI is more of a matching tool for now, and not so much as like a replacement for outreach. Like all of
Yeah.
that mass outreach and the fact that it's turning so much, maybe the best in class is kind of working on a super high volume basis, which is probably not good either way. But I think pretty quickly, like certainly within our lifetimes, there'll be some sort of ability to check whether or not, even now, I think they just came out with a tool where you could check whether or not like an email you're getting was generated by an agent versus like the person sitting there actually hitting send.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I know we've gone on a little bit here, but I guess if we were to jump on a podcast 12 months from now, and catch up on the last 12 months, like what would you like to see happen within your company that would make that conversation like you'd be like pumped, like we did this, and this? Like, what are the 12-year thing or 12-month things that you're excited about that you would be excited to jump on and chat about?
Yeah, so just what I briefly mentioned, we're launching a platform in the next couple of weeks that we've been working on for a while. It's effectively a productization of our database and workflow. And that was really in response to a lot of client engagements, or not engagement, but pitches, where it's the database and that has an inherent cost. The analyst is full-time salary, that has an inherent cost. So in engaging with us, there's a modest retainer and an advisory fee. And I, again, certainly from a business perspective, but I do think that what we've built, the process, the database, the way that our analysts do what they do, it really works. Like every client, like it works. And I want to get it out there to people. So what we've decided to do was effectively break those kind of in half, where the database and the workflow are now being productized. Our analysts are sitting on it anyway, but soon we'll release it, so that someone can come. It's going to be called Fundex. Someone can come to us and for a much, much lower fee on a monthly basis, just have access to that platform, that workflow, still have access to a banker. It's bi-weekly instead of weekly, but that banker will be interacting and still pushing leads out to our clients on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you engage. Yeah, no, I like it. I was going to ask you how a client engages with you, but it sounds like it's a retainer plus some type of advisory fee on. Okay, got it. Yep. Got it. Awesome. Well, this has been. I've got probably 30 more questions that I could ask, but I definitely want to be respectful of your time. And everybody listening to this, they don't want to hear me keep blabbering on. So I guess we'll end the conversation the way I end every episode with a 3-pack of questions. So first one here is, what's an influential book or podcast that you'd like to recommend?
A book by the title of Productize. Armstrong, Eileen Armstrong. I could be butchering her name entirely. Aisha.
Okay.
Yes, I'm probably butchering, but the title of the book is Productize. It's an incredible book, especially for anyone that is providing services as opposed to like a software. And it goes through how you take a service into then a managed service, and then ultimately productize that managed service so that you can achieve scalability.
I'll have to check that one
out. Really
really
great book. Highly recommend it.
Got it. Question 2 here. What is your favorite thing to do outside of work?
I have 2 young children, so if I'm not sitting at work, I'm trying to spend time with them, doing whatever I can do. Weekends are usually packed of birthday parties, pizza, and baseball now in the spring. So if I'm not at work, I'm with family. Got it.
Fair enough. Well, that's a good dovetail in the last one. So favorite vacation spot?
Mediterranean. Although I haven't been in since having kids, unfortunately. I think pretty much anywhere on the Mediterranean. I haven't been everywhere there, but just one of the most awesome places. You get everything you want: beach, history, archaeology, good food, good people.
Cool. Very cool. Appreciate that. That's awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation, Jeffrey. Really appreciate the time. If people, maybe a founder's here, they're trying to raise money or about to, or people just want to learn more about what you're doing, like what's the best way to, get in touch with you?
Drop me a line, please, directly. My email is my first name, Jeffrey, @Fidelman, spelled by my last name, co.com. So Jeffrey at FidelmanCo.com. I'm usually pretty responsive, so I have a 12 to 24 hour rule. If you don't hear from me by then call the authorities.
Fair enough. We'll add all that stuff in the show notes. But yeah, Jeffrey, awesome. I really appreciate the time. Great to meet you and get to know you and hear about your story. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on.
I hope you found at least one actionable insight from this episode of the Growth Capital Podcast, your one-stop shop for insights from private equity leaders, CEOs, and startup entrepreneurs on starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, as well as the role having the right talent plays in growing a successful business. It would be greatly appreciated if you would rate and review this podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and drop us a comment so we can expand the audience of this podcast. Thank you for all your support, and don't forget about upcoming episodes dropping every Tuesday.